What's up, everybody? This video is going to be an extension to the previous video on viruses. In that video, we went over some of the characteristics of viruses. We saw what a typical virus looks like, and we went over the factors and the reason that allow viruses to evolve to evolve quickly in their given environment. In this video, we're going to see and go through the general life cycle of a virus. So, the necessary steps that viruses take in order to survive and reproduce. And before we jump into it, we have a question. And the question is whether you think viruses are living or non-living. So, in other words, are viruses alive? And right away, you might be thinking this is a silly question. And I also think it's a silly question because for something that can do such a significant damage across the globe, they're able to affect the economy negatively. They can make us sick, and in a lot of cases, they make us really, really sick. And worst of all, viruses can kill us, and they have killed a lot of people. So to question whether viruses are alive can sound silly, right? But let's just take some time and think about it because it's an interesting question. What consideration do we have to make in order to say that something is living? What set of rules that we need to follow to say that something is living or alive? Okay, so if your answer is living and you're thinking this is ridiculous, we know viruses can go from one person to another. They make us sick and they have the potential to really mess up our well-being. And it's difficult to get rid of them. So there's no way we should consider viruses to be non-living. Now, interestingly, the answer that viruses are living can both be correct and incorrect. But the general acceptance leans more toward non-living. And here's why. What counts as life is still being defined. The question of what it means to be alive remains unsolved. So there's a general set of rules that we follow, so-called properties of life. So for example, one of the properties of life is organization. So organization, it refers to molecules, organelles, cell and different types of cells working together, different parts working together to form a system that helps an organism to perform a particular task. Another properties of life is metabolism. So this is the chemical reaction that take place that make it possible for organisms to do work, such as moving around or catching a prey. And a property such as homeostasis. So this is the regulation of internal environment for cell function. Other life properties include growth, reproduction, response, and evolution. When we look at all of these properties and we think about viruses, and recall from the previous video that viruses are kind of very simple, right? They don't have much going on when it comes to composition. They just have a genome, and surrounding the genome is a structure called a capsid, which are made out of proteins, right? So when thinking about all of these properties, and for example, we look at organization, viruses don't have organelles, right? They don't have organelles, they don't have a cell, and they don't have multiple parts working together to form a system. So when it comes to organization, viruses lack that properties. And viruses don't carry out their own metabolism, and it's not clear that they maintain homeostasis. Now, with regards to evolution, however, viruses do in fact have the ability to evolve. And we talked a lot about it in the previous video. And when it comes to reproduction, viruses can reproduce, but they cannot reproduce on their own. They need a host. And they need a host because viruses do not have the resources and the tools to reproduce. And the host is where the resources and the tools are. And viruses use the host resources for them to survive and reproduce. So, with all of these life properties in mind, we can now clearly see that viruses do not possess all of these life properties, or most of it. And that's how we have come to the conclusion of the general acceptance that viruses are considered non-living. Okay, so we have answered the question of whether viruses are non-living or living. And the fact that viruses need a host in order for them to survive and reproduce, because the host is where the resources are. And speaking of resources, let's now finally jump into the actual life cycle of a virus. Okay, so what we have here is an example of a host cell. And on the left is a virus. And the first move of viruses is to move closer to the host cell and bind onto the surface outside the cell, just like so. And notice the red little things on the cell membrane here are the protein receptors. And these protein receptors on the cell membrane, their function is to recognize and bind to specific substances outside the cell. And so viruses attach themselves to the host cell using the receptor proteins. And this first step that viruses take is known as attachment. The next move that viruses make is to try to get inside the host cell. And there are a number of ways that they can do that. For example, bacteriophages. They infect bacteria by injecting their DNA from outside through the cell membrane. And another common way that viruses can go inside the host cell is through endocytosis, where a vesicle, like a little bubble, is created so that viruses can move into the host cell just like so. Once the virus is in the cytoplasm of the cell, what happens is the capsid of the virus will come apart, and that will release the RNA genome or the DNA genome of the virus. So the virus gets inside the host cell by endocytosis. Inside the cytoplasm, the capsid comes apart, releasing the genome. And this second step that viruses take is known as the entry. The virus is inside the host cell. What's going to happen next? What's going to happen is the genome is going to be copied. It's going to replicate. And they are being replicated by an enzyme, a viral enzyme. Once many copies of the genome is made, gene expression will take place, which is to say that the genes, which are the small section within the viral genome, are going to make its way to the machinery within the host cell called the ribosome. And recall that ribosomes are responsible for translating RNA to amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. So translation will take place, and what we get is the product of various proteins. And one of the proteins that is going to be created is the capsids proteins. So inside the cytoplasm of the host cell, the virus's genome, the genome of the virus is going to make copies of themselves. Then the genes within the genomes are going to be expressed. So that translation can occur using the host ribosome, where various types of proteins is produced, including the capsid proteins. And this particular process, The third step is known as the replication and gene expression. So now what happens after the replication and the gene expression? The capsid protein and the genome are going to come together to make new viral particles. So the fourth step is called the assembly. The capsid and the genome will keep on making new viral particles as long as there are resources inside the host cell. So you can imagine that the number of new viruses will keep on increasing inside the cell and take up the spaces inside the cell. And one of the things that can happen is the cell will lyse or burst, releasing the new viral particles. And another way that the new viruses can exit the host cell is through exocytosis. And here is what it looks like. The virus will essentially go to the edge of the host cell and then diffuse through the membrane of the host cell, making a vesicle, like a little bubble, to exit the host cell. Each new virus that's produced inside the host cell will try to exit the host cell and then go infect other host cells. And the process in which the virus exits the host cell is known as release. So this is essentially the general life cycle of a virus. And after each new virus is released from the host cell, the whole process will be repeated, starting from attachment. So to summarize the video, we learned that viruses are considered non-living, and one of the reasons is that they don't have the resources and the tools in order to reproduce on their own. So we learned that they need a host because the host is where the resources are. And we learned the process and the steps that viruses have to go through in order to get that resources, from attachment through entry, replication and gene expression, assembly, and through release in order for viruses to survive and reproduce.